At 6:35 a.m. UTC on February 28th, US Central Command announced that American forces, alongside allied partners, had begun airstrikes against Iran. Over the following 50 days, American and Israeli strikes carved a path of devastation across the Islamic Republic. 13,000 sorties, losses running into the hundreds of billions of dollars, a significant share of Iran's conventional military capacity and defense industrial base destroyed. And at the top of the target list, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself killed, along with a string of other figures from the very apex of the Ayatollah regime. Those 50 days were, above all, a story of chaos. Blockades, suspensions and sanctions were imposed, lifted and reimposed, sometimes within the span of just a few hours. The result? The global economy caught in a vise, the Iranian regime fighting to the last drop of blood, and no sensible exit from the war. That is also why this 50-day mark is the right moment for an initial balance sheet, even though the opening passage of this episode might suggest a complete American victory. It is not. The asymmetry of objectives means that any serious accounting of gains and losses becomes far more uncomfortable for Washington than raw numbers suggest. So uncomfortable, in fact, that a legitimate question now demands an answer. Are the Americans suffering from a strategic failure in Iran? And evidence suggests they are. Today, wars aren't decided by firepower alone. They are won through strategy, how you manage resources, build alliances, and respond faster than your opponent. That's exactly what Supremacy World War III is all about. A free-to-play PvP strategy game where you take control of a real-world nation in the middle of a global crisis. You will be competing in real time against up to 99 other players, with matches that can last for weeks. You will grow your economy and build a modern military, from tanks and fighter jets to submarines and advanced missile systems, all while fighting step by step for global dominance. There is also the Elite Officers system, unique commanders you unlock and upgrade permanently, giving you new strategic options and long-term advantages in future games. The game is available on both PC and mobile, so you can jump back in whenever you want. Check out the link in the description to claim your free seasonal unit, the Elite Railgun, worth $40. This offer is available to new players and valid for 30 days. Before we begin, two things need to be established. Every military campaign can be evaluated through multiple lenses. In geopolitics, the decisive criterion is national interest. So the only rational foundation for assessing Operation Epic Fury is the interest of the American empire. Second, this is a conflict still in progress. The conclusions presented here are strategic in nature and therefore long-term. But nobody has a crystal ball. With that established, let's start, perhaps counterintuitively, with the wins. The upsides: invaluable combat experience. Every military trains, but only actual warfare separates doctrine from reality. An operation of this scale, coordinating multiple branches across a live theater, gives any fighting force something no exercise can replicate: genuine feedback on what works and, more importantly, what doesn't. Consider the sheer weight of American power brought to bear here. 3 carrier strike groups, destroyers, fighters, bombers, early warning aircraft, satellites. In a single theater, the United States field-tested the B-2, the F-35, Tomahawk cruise missiles, the MQ-9 Reaper, low-cost kamikaze drones, artificial intelligence targeting systems, and the full architecture of aerial refueling and command and control. Roughly 50,000 troops supported the operation across the region. Now contrast that with America's principal strategic rival, the People's Republic of China. The last time the People's Liberation Army conducted a live combined arms operation of this kind was 47 years ago in the border war with Vietnam. The PLA looks formidable on parade grounds and in Taiwan Strait exercises, but its actual combat effectiveness will remain an open question right up until the moment a real conflict begins. And as history repeatedly demonstrates, real conflict has a way of exposing every hidden weakness with brutal efficiency. Factor in as well the stress testing of the logistical and industrial supply chains that any sustained American campaign depends on. The old maxim still holds: wars are won by logistics, and the Americans never stop practicing that, confirming the willingness to use force. This one is purely strategic. By striking Iran without hesitation, America proved it doesn't just bluff, it acts. When Washington's threats repeatedly prove empty, strategic deterrence collapses. Adversaries grow bolder, more willing to test the limits of American power projection. Going to war changes that calculus. It demonstrates that Washington will follow through even at scale. Which means that next time, America's rivals may think twice before testing the bluff. Conventional degradation of the Ayatollah regime. Thousands of bombs dropped, much of the political leadership decapitated, the Navy and Air Force effectively annihilated. Iran's losses are beyond dispute, and for a Tehran already strangled by sanctions, rebuilding will be extraordinarily difficult. The economic consequences of the war are devastating. It is hard to put into words. Every sector has been affected. Poria Asteraki, a Tehran-based engineer, told the New York Times. 3 anonymous Iranian officials put the damage at a minimum of $300 billion. To this point, we can now add the American naval blockade of Iran, designed to compound the Islamic Republic's structural economic problems still further. The Ayatollahs have always named the United States as an existential enemy, so American interests are served directly by Iran's conventional weakness. Tehran is also widely regarded as the most powerful state in the Middle East, particularly its eastern half, and its neighbors, many of them American allies, have long feared its reach. Systematically degrading Iranian capabilities is, without question, an entry on the plus side of the ledger. Coming to the aid of its most important ally, Israel. This point will likely provoke debate, so it's worth separating into 2 readings. If one accepts that a close alliance with the Jewish state serves core American strategic interests, then backing Israel here almost certainly deepened that unbreakable bond. Tel Aviv knows its big brother across the ocean will show up when it matters. But the alternative question is whether that bond has led the United States into strategic defeat, because on the other side of the ledger, the list is considerably longer. The downsides: reinforcing suspicions of foreign influence at the heart of American power. That is the other side of the same coin. A reasonable question can be asked: was American entry into this war actually justified? Given the costs, which we are about to unpack, that is doubtful. What is not doubtful is who wanted American participation: Israel. At this point, Washington's allies, particularly in the Middle East, where most of the costs are being felt, may be asking themselves 2 questions. First, if this war appears contrary to American interests, does that mean the pro-Israel faction within the American deep state is powerful enough to push through decisions of this magnitude? And if the answer is yes, should we be building our grand strategy around Washington? That question is now live in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. But there is also an alternative explanation: the perception among allies of strategic decision-making adrift. Israel lobbied hard for American entry into the war against Iran, just as Ukraine lobbied hard for American entry into the war against Russia. But that doesn't mean the decision was the result of foreign manipulation. Applying Occam's razor, it may simply reflect poor strategic analysis. Iran is thousands of miles from American soil, poses no existential threat to the United States. After repeated strikes on both the country and the axis of resistance, Tehran was already at its weakest point in decades. Washington was winning the strategic confrontation without a doubt. It didn't need to do anything. But launching a full-scale war and backing an adversary into a corner is a fundamentally different challenge. Because anyone backed against a wall will fight with everything they have, to the very end. And that is a recipe for another forever war. As we have covered on this channel before, Iran absorbed some devastating blows. Political leadership was decimated, but the regime did not fall, and right now there is little to indicate that it will. Which brings us to the next entry on the loss side, arguably the most significant one. Failure to achieve the war's primary objective, while making the underlying problem worse. One might ask, what was this war actually supposed to accomplish? Trump's chaotic communication hasn't made that easy to answer, but a closer reading suggests that virtually none of the plausible objectives were met, and the problems may only be deepening. The primary goal appears to have been eliminating Iran's nuclear program. Operation Midnight Hammer was supposed to do that. It didn't. There is no credible evidence that Iran's nuclear program has stopped functioning. Worse still, the new political leadership may prove even more aggressive in pursuing weapons of mass destruction, not less. The war has demonstrated, viscerally, that a nuclear deterrent is the only reliable guarantee against aggression, even from a hegemon. North Korea is a far more vulnerable state, yet no one, despite the rhetoric, moves against Kim Jong-un. Trump also floated regime change, but the regime didn't fall. Instead, it gained martyrs, Khamenei and company, and has embedded itself even deeper into the fabric of the Islamic Republic. The Ayatollahs were already struggling to legitimize their rule amid mounting economic dysfunction. The direct American attack handed them a lifeline. And among ordinary Iranians, the sense of apathy may now only deepen. If a full American assault couldn't topple the Ayatollahs, what will? The regime, despite its human losses, which in ideological terms actually may strengthen it, through the logic of martyrdom, may also have discovered something about the weight of its own hand. The ambitions of Iran's subsequent demands suggest exactly that. The strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz was always understood in theory. What nobody knew in practice was whether Iran could effectively choke off Gulf energy exports, or how Washington would respond if it tried. The war answered both questions. Add to that the strikes on critical regional infrastructure. Taken together, the Ayatollahs may have learned that their leverage is greater than they ever assumed. Because backed into a corner, Iran was able to take the global economy hostage. The impact on the global and domestic economy. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz triggered the worst oil crisis in 50 years, a crisis that is still ongoing with no clear end in sight. The price of crude crossed $100 a barrel, with spikes reaching $141. Physical shortages are emerging on global markets, and that's before accounting for refined products, natural gas, and fertilizers. Despite the narratives pushed by the current administration, the United States remains a deeply globalized economy. America is the world's largest importer, and its service-based exports depend on the purchasing power of countries around the world. Striking at the price and supply of the world's primary conventional fuel, and then scrambling to contain the fallout, is a cost that lands squarely on the party that started it. Which brings us to the next consequence: rising instability across the Middle East. This is geopolitical algebra. Iran has tested its hand and found it stronger than expected. It has proven that even from a position of economic and military weakness, it can hold the world to ransom. Power has shifted to hardliners who believe only force guarantees Iran's survival. And crucially, the Iranian army and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the backbone of Iranian military power, emerged largely intact. Given all of that, the outlook for the regional stability is bleak. Add an ever-combative Israel determined to finish the job, a Saudi Arabia and UAE deeply unsettled by the war, and you have a powder keg that could detonate at any moment. Consider what happens if the Americans quietly exit, concluding, as Trump has hinted, that the war no longer pencils out. Every Gulf state, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, would be left entirely exposed to Tehran demands. And those demands, as Washington is already discovering, will be maximalist. Iran, despite its losses, could rapidly recover its regional standing, becoming the power that must be consulted on everything. That doesn't just erode American influence in the region, it risks overturning the entire regional order, up to and including the prospect of a larger war. Which is why, despite the mounting costs, Washington keeps searching for a way out. But there is no exit from this position that doesn't come with a price. Squandering capabilities on the eve of a war over Taiwan. Looming over all of this is a potential conflict with an adversary in an entirely different weight class, China. The entire rationale for cutting off arms to Ukraine, articulated in part by now Undersecretary Elbridge Colby, rested on a single logic: conserve resources for the most critical theater, the Western Pacific. One could agree or disagree, but it was coherent. Stockpiles of missiles and munitions were to be preserved and expanded, ready for a potential war over Taiwan. Instead, thousands of critical American munitions rained down on Iran. Stockpiles that were already running low are now critically depleted. The shortfalls are concentrated precisely where they matter most: precision weapons like the Tomahawk and JASM-ER, the systems central to neutralizing a Chinese invasion fleet. Air defense interceptors, Patriot and THAAD, have been similarly drained. At current production rates, replenishment could even take years. Yes, as noted on the plus side, the Americans gave themselves a rigorous live-fire test. But the price was steep, and not only in dollars and depleted stockpiles. A lifeline for the Russian Federation. A cynic might say the Americans managed to hit 3 targets with 1 strike, allowing the Ayatollah regime to entrench itself further and boost its own standing, handing the People's Liberation Army a near-term advantage in any fight over Taiwan, and delivering a critically needed breathing space to a Russia still grinding through Ukraine. Quite an achievement. There is no question that blocking Russian oil exports serves American interests. Trump himself tightened that policy. But the Hormuz blockade effectively lifted the Kremlin out from under its sanctions, pushing Russian weekly budget revenues to the highest levels in nearly 4 years. Ukraine's own strike campaign tried to offset the effect of rising oil prices and sanctions relief, but even that couldn't prevent Moscow from pocketing this windfall. Washington didn't just open a new theater on the global chessboard, it poured fuel on the largest fire already burning, one that has been raging for over 4 years. The damage to Allied perceptions of American military power. The campaign's reception on the world stage carries its own cost. The Americans had little to gain here and much to lose. That calculus proved correct. Iran was supposed to fold quickly, outgunned, out-technologied, holding no meaningful cards. Instead, American and Israeli forces operating remotely without boots on the ground proved unable to break Iranian capacity, and Iran's precision strikes have dented the image of American military supremacy in the eyes of both allies and adversaries. Down F-15s, a E-3 Sentry, KC-135 tankers, a C-130J. None of these represent a serious material loss for the world's most powerful military, but they represent a serious crack in the myth of US invulnerability. A larger crack still is the US Navy's failure to forcibly reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran using cheap weapons has exposed the limits of American power, and the last thing that the superpower needs is for its adversaries to know those limits, let alone begin testing them. That said, we should be careful not to lay this at the feet of the generals. Without a ground invasion, neutralizing the nuclear program or toppling the regime was likely never achievable from the air alone. So the failure is not military, it is strategic. And that means the accountability rests with the politicians. Is that the end of the ledger? Not quite. 3 more items remain. The first, burning political capital within the Western alliance. This point connects directly to how allies are reading American strategic judgment. Trump was furious when European partners refused to join Operation Epic Fury. Threats to withdraw from NATO surfaced in the messaging. Every alliance runs a kind of a balance sheet. Allies bring things to the table, but they don't drain each other's goodwill recklessly, because that capital needs to be preserved for moments that truly matter. When Europe looks at Epic Fury and sees a poorly conceived operation, no clear exit, and an inherently offensive posture, standing aside is the rational response. All the more so because NATO, by name and by treaty, has a specific geographic scope, one that the Americans deliberately drew to prevent post-colonial European powers from dragging Washington into their problems elsewhere in the world. Add to that the recent American posturing toward the territorial integrity of NATO members Canada and Denmark, and the alliance's internal tensions become harder to paper over. Trump likes to frame things as America single-handedly sustaining NATO. That's an illusion. Yes, America dominates the alliance, but the alliance has consistently shown up for American projects and remains a critical customer for American defense industry. Europeans deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan costly, offensive, and in retrospect senseless campaigns that consumed billions of dollars and hundreds of lives. The rest of NATO never dragged America into anything comparable. And Ukraine? Ukraine is not in NATO. Support for Kyiv operated outside the treaty framework, though it was clearly in the interest of European NATO members. But let's be honest, containing Russian aggression is also in America's imperial interest. If the situation were reversed, if Israel faced a land invasion and America asked Europe to join, that would be a genuine analogy, and Europe's response would look very different. Nuance is everything. On to the penultimate point: the disconnect between strategic documents and reality. Paper accepts anything. Last December, Washington unveiled a new national security strategy, widely covered, heralded as the dawn of a new era in American foreign policy. The NSS laid out American geographic priorities in explicit order. First, the Western Hemisphere and unchallenged American dominance there. Second, China and strategic competition. Third, the European theater. Fourth, and distant fourth, the Middle East. Below that, only Africa. It gets even more interesting when you read the fine print. The NSS openly acknowledges that the variables which once made the Middle East a priority no longer apply, that the rationale for deep American engagement there has run its course. In retrospect, one passage reads with particular irony, quote, "We should encourage and applaud reform when and where it emerges organically, without trying to impose it from without. The key to successful relations with the Middle East is accepting the region, its leaders, and its nations as they are, while working together on areas of common interest." Well, that didn't quite work out. And then there is the NSS opening logic, quote, "An American strategy must evaluate, sort, and prioritize. Not every country, region, issue, or cause, however worthy, can be the focus of American strategy. The purpose of foreign policy is the protection of core national interests. That is the sole focus of this strategy." Unquote. Strategy, it seems, went one way, reality went another. And the final point makes that clearest of all. Global proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps the greatest paradox of all, the nuclear program America set out to destroy may end up more widespread than ever, the geopolitical Streisand effect. If the Iranian regime survives this war, and the evidence suggests it will almost certainly redouble its pursuit of a nuclear weapon, convinced it is the only guarantee of survival. Worse, leaders around the world are drawing the obvious lesson from both Iran and Ukraine. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate, proven deterrent. North Korea has demonstrated that conclusively. The race won't be limited to Iran. Saudi Arabia and the UAE has the resources to pursue it. Turkey and Egypt are almost certainly running the calculations. Similar conversations are now actively underway in South Korea, Japan, Sweden, Poland, Germany, and Ukraine. Reckless strategy produces unintended consequences. The case laid out above demonstrates that the war against Iran, waged in this form, not only fails to serve American interests, but actively works against them over the long term. Despite tactical gains, like the conventional degradation of the Ayatollah regime and the disruption of the nuclear program, the war solves none of the systemic problems. Worse, it sets the long-term trajectory in a direction fundamentally adverse to the United States, unless Washington finds a way to topple or compel the regime in the course of this conflict. Right now, nothing points to that. A US Navy blockade of the Strait of Hormuz appears to be the last instrument of coercion short of a ground invasion, and while Iran depends heavily on its own hydrocarbon exports, we circle back to the same motive, the fight to the last drop of blood that the Ayatollahs believe they are now compelled to wage. Recent episodes, such as the shelling and boarding an Iranian tanker by the US Navy and Tehran's refusal to take part in the next round of talks, indicate that this entire mess is by no means nearing its end. And sure, the United States is powerful enough that even the mistakes outlined in this episode do not pose an existential threat. But the accumulation of strategic failures, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, combined with the dismantling of its own alliances, NATO, an apologetic posture toward revisionist powers, Russia, and the deliberate antagonizing of the European Union, the primary export market for America's technology giants, constitutes an inexplicable pattern of self-inflicted damage. One way or another, America, and thus the American people, will pay for it. Quick reminder, Supremacy World War III is a free-to-play PvP strategy game, where you compete against real players for global dominance. Head to the link in the description to claim your free Elite Railgun unit, worth $40. The offer is valid for 30 days and available to new players only.